Thank you, Ashton. Can you give me co-hosting privileges so I can share my screen? I gave it away to you and now I don't have it. Thank you. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We're on lecture 3, and I'm going to say just a few things to surface the key ideas as I saw them in this lecture, and then we'll talk about it. Unless Ashton might want to chime in too. We'll see. But I'm going to use a piece of software to visualize the rhythms that Steiner is trying to clue us into. And I'll show that to you in a second. And this is both a bit of a danger because it's easy, as Steiner repeats again at the beginning of this lecture, for us to mistake the model for the reality. And so what I'll show you is a kind of model that just helps us visualize the rhythms, but it's, potentially misleading if we try to get a flattened two-dimensional representation of the movements of spheres, the gestures of beings. How about that? A better way of putting it. When we try to flatten this out in a way that our sort of spatializing mathematical imaginations can grok, we capture something interesting, but we potentially lose sight of the concrete reality. So just keep that in mind. But Steiner, again, is at the beginning of this lecture reminding us that everybody knows, or pretty much every astronomer at this point knows, that Copernicus's model is inadequate if we think that it's a mapping of the real facts, right? If we're just looking for a practical way of correlating observed facts, Ptolemy's model is just as good as Copernicus's. Actually, it was more accurate than Copernicus's, right? Kepler and Newton needed to tweak it to make it as accurate as Ptolemy's model. And so Steiner's concern with contemporary astronomy is that, it's conflating the models with the real facts, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for modern astronomers to reconcile the model to the reality because contemporary science leaves the human being out, and we have to put the human being back into the cosmos before we can actually, in a participatory way, understand the gestures and the rhythms that we see traced in the heavens, and that we ourselves, as living organisms, not just physical beings, but etheric, astral, and spiritual beings, that we ourselves are participating in. And so our human body becomes the instrument that Steiner wants us to tune to these celestial rhythms. And we've become so accustomed to thinking that, oh, well, when you do astronomy, you need a telescope. And he's not saying, we can't learn anything from telescopes, but he's saying we have an instrument already. It's fallen into disrepair, for most of us, because we're taught that there's nothing we could possibly learn about the real facts by tuning into our subjective experience, so-called. But Steiner says, no, we need to perfect this instrument. So when we look at the heavens, though, through our physical sense organs, they appear to be separate from us, independent from us, that their movements have nothing to do with our daily rhythms, annual rhythms, monthly rhythms, right, that we experience more directly in our living organism. Our eyes make it seem like those are just bodies really far away in external space. And that's a kind of illusion. What our eyes show to us very clearly and distinctly is a kind of illusion. And there's a subtler form of perception, of supersensible perception, that Steiner is trying to wake us up to. And he's just pointing out that this is the direction astronomy would need to go in the future to grant us more concrete knowledge and understanding of the heavens. There's a lot of work to do, even if we understand cognitively what he's trying to suggest that we do to change our methodology. There's still a lot of hard work to do to actually produce knowledge using that methodology, right? So, he points out just another example of how science has become so abstract that geology and mineralogy, they study the earth as though it were just a physical being, which leaves out the plant realm or the etheric realm, the animal realm, or the astral realm, and the human realm, or the spiritual. And that the concrete earth, the true earth, is not just a rock, right? It's a living, ensouled, divine being. And if we want to understand the earth's position relative to the other spheres of the cosmos, we need to consider it in all its dimensions. And we can do so, again, by bringing ourselves, our full humanity, back into the phenomenon that we are trying to observe. We are part of the phenomenon we are trying to observe, right? So he talks about how plants are more intimately connected to the heavens than just the mineral realm, and that vegetation is the kind of sense organ of the earth. It opens its eyes to the cosmic forces in summer, and it closes its eyes in winter. And he talks about this polarity of exfoliation as a result of the sun forces meeting the plant world, and then the earth forces, as the earth kind of tilts away from the sun, pulls the plant realm back into a contracted seed-like state, or point us what etheric space is like. It has a qualitative polarization, and it's a process. It's, rather than a physical space, it's a kind of polarized process of spaciation, right? Where the plant realm is expanding and contracting in relationship to the solar and terrestrial forces. And so he's giving us a hint here into what a qualitative astronomy would look like, that considers more than just the physical dimension, but also the etheric. And then he goes on to talk about this sort of astral layer of the earth, which he is linking to the rhythm, the daily, the diurnal rhythm, which is related to the interactivity of the human soul, he says. Right? So the diurnal rhythm is related to our inner soul life. And the annual rhythm, he says, is more related to our physical growth processes, and particularly the first 7 years of childhood development and the way that the skull is shaped, that this physical process of formation and growth in our bodies is more to do with this annual rhythm of the earth in relationship to the sun, right? Whereas the inner soul life has more to do with the diurnal daily rhythm. And he goes on to talk about he brings in the lunar forces and the 28-day cycle, this other rhythm that is especially connected to the bodily processes of female organisms, at least those animals which menstruate, and that the male organism still has this rhythm. It's just kind of more subtle and etheric. And he connects memory to menstruation in a very interesting way. He says that just as menstruation is this kind of cosmic rhythm that is rest free from the cosmos, from the lunar rhythm. In other words, the cycles of the moon are the same time frame as the menstrual cycle, but the menstrual cycle has sort of been individuated. It's not always in sync with the moon. And in the same way, our own memory, we don't need to observe the event which produces the memory at the same time. We can remember later. And so there's this kind of analogy that he's making, which astrologically, memory and menstruation and the body and all these things are connected to the moon. And this was helping me understand some of these subtler archetypal correlations that astrologers will talk about. And Steiner's giving us a very concrete sense of why these things are connected. And then he talks about the Saturn cycle, this 28-year cycle, which is in some special relationship to the 28-day cycle of the moon, but again, having more to do with the development of our physical bodies. And so he's trying to give us a sense again for how a qualitative astronomy that puts the human being in all of our layers, physical, etheric, astral, and spiritual, back into the cosmos as a legitimate organ of perception, an instrument by which we might come to deeper knowledge of the world around us. And he's just giving us some hints as to what this would look like. He ends this chapter talking about how Kepler still had an intuition of this universal life, of the movements of the planetary spheres as meaningful gestures, rather than just isolated bodies obeying a fixed law of gravity as Newton had it. The mathematics, I admit, was a little bit beyond me, but I kind of had an intuitive feel for what Steiner was describing there about the difference between Kepler's view and Newton's view. So I'll pause there. Let me just quickly show you what I wanted to, just to give you a picture of these rhythms. This is a piece of software called Archetypal Explorer. It's archetypalexplorer.com. If you want to check it out. This is just a view of the relationship between the annual movement of the sun and the monthly movement of the moon, and the nodes there having to do with when eclipses occur. And so you can just kind of get a sense of this rhythm. And we can also see sort of the difference between, on the left, the heliocentric view versus the geocentric view as regards retrograde motion of the planets. And I'll share a link if you guys want to play with this on your own later, but it's just neat to sort of see the correspondence between two very different models and how they both show us something of a kind of a higher dimensional process that no one model can really reveal in its entirety. Anyways, that's it. Ashton, did you want to add anything, or should we just open it up?
Yeah, just a couple things. They were implicit in what you shared. That was great. But just I wanted to note a couple of moments in the chapter that stood out to me, especially as far as this methodology is concerned. On page 42, at least in this edition, Steiner describes what Matt was speaking about when he was portraying the polarity that the plant world bodies forth for us throughout the year. Steiner describes this as reading spatial relations in terms of their qualities. So I thought that was an important thing to just pull out, because it's the reverse of what we're used to. And then again, in connection with this at the end, Matt also referred to this, especially when he was saying that the mathematics was a bit beyond him, but he could feel into it. I just thought it was significant to note Steiner describing the mathematics, in relation to Kepler's laws as describing an inner experience. And so I'll stop there. Max, want to go ahead and share?
Yeah, I'll just maybe carry forward your last point, Ashton. And this, I guess I'm curious to hear from all of you. If I understood correctly, Steiner, what he's trying to say, in his view, what Newton does is abstracts away the spatial relationships and accounts for, in the way that Kepler preserved this harmony between space and time in the form of these ratios between planetary motion. Newton took away the time aspect and retained the space aspect, and he complemented that with positing the universal force of gravitation. That's what I took away from it. I would like to be corrected if I'm wrong, or if anyone if anyone's capable of elaborating a little bit.
Yeah, that's helpful, Max. I was just thinking while reading it of a similar thing that Bergson does in the 20th century when he critiques the spatialization of time in mechanistic science. And I think that's kind of akin to what Steiner is critiquing about Newton's approach here, that when you take time out, you're taking life out, and that the rhythm that Kepler is still feeling into with his mathematics is lost in Newton's approach, where what was this sort of qualitative rhythm that we could intuit in the math is now just a force, the inverse square ratio, right?
I think it's even worse than that. It's like time by itself or space by itself. It's not like it's an abstraction. What you really have are is like motion. And what we do is again, from something that is concrete and unified, we abstract the notions of space and time. But if you then start to treat the abstraction as though it is primary, you've done the Whitehead or the misplaced concreteness fallacy. And I think, if I'm correct about this, I wasn't able to attend the first meeting, but wasn't Gopi Vijaya present and trying to actually propose like an alternative way of thinking about this? It's intriguing to me because it seems absolutely necessary in this case. I'd also like to propose that we just talk through the 3 laws of Kepler. I think I have a general understanding of them, but I don't presume I'm the best one capable of explaining them. Maybe somebody else here has a good sense of them.
Yeah, we can circle back to that, Max. That's a good idea. Jeff, do you want to chime in the meantime?
Max, I don't have comments on Kepler. Hope Matt or someone certainly will. But I want to go back to part of Matt's summary. And I apologize, I forget the exact phrase you used, but Matt, you were basically talking about our need to, this is what we're learning from Steiner, our need to reinvigorate our capacity for intuition, this greater life form that the cosmos is, that we're a part of, and rather than a dead material abstraction. Sorry, those weren't your exact words, Matt, but I think you're pointing in that direction. And I want to play off that a little bit. This is certainly one of the main themes of this whole lecture series and much of Steiner's work, of course. But something, as it happens, I'm studying in parallel right now. It's like I'm kind of joining a lot of dots here, in my own path, and that is that I'm reading a certain research piece by Wilhelm Reich right now called "Children of the Future," and I will keep this extremely short. That's a humongous topic itself, but there's something particularly in this lecture where Steiner is talking about all these rhythms, the daily and the annual and the 28-day and the 28-year, and he's kind of illustrating at all the different levels we can participate those rhythms at. And there's something in particular he says, which is that the young child he refers to, and maybe I'm going to mix up my details a bit, but when he's talking about this kind of inner soul capacity, to perceive to perceive cosmic events and things like that. And this is where I want to kind of bring my point home, Matt, on our reawakening this intuitive capacity that we've lost. This young child has this most obvious ability to do that, right? And then presumably that kind of quiets down or transforms as we get older. But how I want to link that to Reich is he has a very interesting concept which he calls the first puberty, and to most mainstream thinking, what would he mean first? Like there's only one, right? But to Reich, this first puberty is those first few years up to about age 6 or 7, which dovetails precisely with what Steiner is talking about here, that young child. And without going into huge detail, this great context in Reich and this first puberty, and what I'm trying to bring back here to Steiner, is that is, like in our whole project here, reawakening this intuition, in Reich's world, those first early years are super critical for what happens to our modern minds, modern humanity, and our basically our blocked capacities. Is the fundamental human armoring occurs in those early years. And then of course we can go off into Steiner and explain it in all the great detail and the astral rhythms and all these things. But yeah, Reich kind of gives us another side to this of where that what he calls that primary genital function, that first puberty gets blocked. And as I say, nobody knows that, nobody sees that, that's not acknowledged anywhere in medicine or physiology, what have you. But we should be very sensitive to this, in anthroposophy, that yeah, we kind of have a more fuller understanding of how and where and when that is getting blocked, and what it takes to to unblock it, which is kind of our project, with the Steiner and otherwise.
Yeah, very interesting. Anyone else have any thoughts coming up? Or we could try to dig into Kepler's laws. Okay, let's do that. Steiner does list them for us on page 50 if you have the book. And maybe I'll just read those and then we can talk about them together. The first law is that the planets move in ellipses around the central body, which is situated in one of the foci of the ellipse. The second law is that the radius vector of a planet sweeps out equal sectors or equal areas over equal periods of time. And the third law is that the squares of the periods of revolution of the different planets are proportional to the cubes of the semi-major axis or axes, which you can simplify by saying the mean distance from the central body. So briefly, I'll just share my understanding here, which is limited, but adding the ellipses was important to make the Copernican heliocentric model more accurate. It's this added layer of complexity that was not present in Copernicus's insistence on maintaining some sense of perfect circular movement. And Steiner points out that an ellipse actually has more life, more dynamism than a perfect circle. The second law accounts for the ways in which the planet moves more quickly when it's closer to the sun and slower when it's further from the sun. Is Ashton going to show this? Great. And then the third law, I believe, is related to Kepler's attempt to get the planetary spheres to kind of nest in one another in a harmonic way using the Platonic solids. And I think he ran into some difficulty with that, but in his finally mathematical way of formulating this, there's some truth to the way in which the orbital, the sizes of the planetary orbits are in some kind of harmonic resonance with each other. That is something like the ratios between the Platonic solids, but I don't know enough about the details to say whether that succeeded or not. Steiner does say that, Newton obviously tried to supersede the need for the third law with his more abstract account of gravity. How'd I do, Max?
No, I think that's really helpful, Matt. I think you did a good job just laying them out. There's like some really intriguing questions about each of the laws. Starting with the third one, that's obviously the most complicated, difficult to grasp. My impression is it's directly though related to, so what you have is time squared is equal to the cube of the cube of the distance times this constant. And isn't it right that that's related to it's related to an argument that Gopi Vijaya makes about the way, so and then you could rearrange that equation and say time squared over the distance to the cube is always equal to this constant. And I hope I'm on the right track here. That's the third law. I also have a question, and folks just feel free to ignore anything and take up anything that's interesting. But the first law about the two foci of the ellipse, the sun, the presence of the sun accounts for the fact of the first focus. What is this what is the second focus? What determines where the second focus is located? then finally in the second law, it's so extraordinary to imagine somebody, Kepler. I mean, this is like universal genius. Stealing the golden vessels of the Egyptians, obviously. To imagine somebody like conceiving of this based on astronomical observations, just extraordinary. But again, I guess I have a question. The rate that it's covering, is it right to think of them as actual ellipses, or is it more, I actually, somehow it seems not quite right to think of them as ellipses. Maybe I have the wrong idea about this, but I picture them all as like ovoid shaped, like an egg, the orbits. So folks, just feel free, anything I think someone's interested in taking up.
Well, I guess, since the sun is moving, the whole system is moving, that there wouldn't be quite, closed ellipses anyway. But I just wanted to share something real quick before handing it off to Karsten, in relation to what you were describing. I mean, this may not exactly connect to the third law, but I guess I was thinking about the third law, especially, and I guess Matt pointed this out, that in connection with Kepler's vision of the proportional relationships between the different planetary paths, and with the ideal of the music of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres. And when he says, when Steiner says on the last page of this lecture, when he's trying to evoke the inner, or the participation of the Earth's movement, he's describing, you constantly have to take care that you don't skid, that you don't go into a skid, that you don't go too fast, and that your radius vector doesn't sweep out too great an area. And so I was just thinking about that as a kind of expression of the second and third laws, of the liveliness of the planetary system, and the different paths in relation to each other that the planets weave. Not sure how much that's actually related to the two last laws, but anyway, Karsten, what are you thinking?
What I found intriguing in this description by Steiner of Kepler's law was the fact that Matt, he touched upon it, that an ellipse is something that's more dynamic or more alive than just a perfect circle. But I also thought that it's somehow implied in what Steiner is saying here, that you could say the archetypical motion of the universe is a cycle, rather than, if you look at, for example, Newton's laws, there you have the idea that all motion, unless some force acts upon it, is rectilinear. That's the idea of Newton, whereas Steiner is actually saying here that if there is not some kind of living entity acting upon some kind of object, it will just go into a cyclical motion, which then becomes kind of, in how I think it is, that it becomes kind of the archetypical motion in the universe. But living entities kind of act in the polarity, you could say, between the cyclical motion and the rectilinear motion, and it seems to me like cyclical motion, it's some kind of resting phase, whereas to impose a rectilinear motion, you actually need a lot of power. And so you can, for example, you can think about human culture, how it has kind of imposed rectilinear motion, say in architecture, in technology, and all these artifacts created by man since the scientific revolution came about, is actually this forceful impression of rectilinear motion somehow, and rectilinear forms, which kind of, I mean, it's like we couldn't get any further away from the archetypical form, and so it seems like there's some kind of balance to be achieved between this cyclical motion that is also somehow, I mean, it's less alive than elliptical, for example. So I just think there's something very interesting there. Even though Steiner doesn't say a lot about it, it kind of stirred a lot of thoughts in my mind, at least.
Yeah, go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of Karsten's comment about rectilinear motion and circular motion. In a certain way, they're, I don't know if antitheses is the right word, but in a certain way, they're like qualitatively different kinds of motion, but in another way, they are not. And the way that they're not is that all that rectilinear motion is circular motion taken to its limit at infinity. And
yeah, I get it. Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the tangents, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to add there, I actually agree. I don't think there is such a thing. Whenever we see something that looks like linear motion, it's part of a cycle with a size that, I mean, if the radius becomes very big, what is cyclical will look like a linear motion. So there's some kind of illusion at play then. And of course, if you go to infinity, then you just get the rectilinear motion. So there's a continuity there and a connection. Good point.
I think this thought experiment comes from Nicholas of Cusa, if I'm not mistaken. But it's the idea of, folks are encouraged to imagine the way that if you have, imagine a circle and it has this certain, the circumference. And then if you start to expand the circumference, that the way that like one segment of that circumference, at first it's clearly, like a segment of a circle. But as you start to expand it, you realize what's happening is with every increase in the radius or the total volume of the circle, total area of the circle, with every time that happens, you're actually, that what appeared to be a curved line is actually approaching the straight line. And so you can see that in like with the mathematical intuition that if you were to like turn that radius, if you were to make that radius into infinity, so too at the same time would the circumference of that circle be a straight line. You can do the same thing in 3 dimensions, imagining that exercise, the thought experiment with a sphere rather than a circle. And then you realize at infinity is a plane. A circle at infinity.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I could just show something here because I have a simple, actually illustrating what you're saying here, Max. I don't know. Can I share something if I want to, or?
I think you should be able to. Do you have the option?
Okay.
Do you see the green button?
It says it's disabled for me. Okay, so I can't.
Okay. Let me see.
No problem.
Here, I'll make you a co-host so you can do it.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
But a part of my inspiration comes from a Danish writer called Martinus, who lived in the 20th century. And he was kind of a mystic, some kind of intuitive genius who wrote a large number of books. And also he made a large number of symbols. And he was making a lot of points that we've brought up in this discussion. For example, the fact that all physicality is basically motion. And I've been pondering on this idea for many years. Well, what is moving? And then I saw this Gobi's presentation of these reciprocal system theory, where he put forward this idea, well, nothing is, motion is the basics, and we have to get away from this idea of something that is actually moving, like a particle and so on. A particle is composed of motion. And so Martinus, he also had this idea about motion being the basics of all physical existence, and also that cyclical motion was the basis. And so he made this symbol, so I'll just try to share it. It's called the law for motion. And can you see it now?
Yes.
So it's quite simple actually. And what he's done here is simply that he's drawn a lot of circles. So each of the lines that you see is part of a circle with different diameters. So I think on the top here, you see something that looks like a rectilinear motion, but in fact, I think it's part of a circle with a diameter of 40 meters or something like that, where he's then made this small section but exactly to illustrate this point that in essence, all motion is cyclical, but once the radius of the cycle goes towards infinity or larger numbers, it will increasingly look like a rectilinear line or rectilinear motion for that. So he calls it's the law of motion that he's describing here in this simple. Yeah, so I just, I don't know how to stop this again. Sorry, I'll just, how do I stop it?
There you go.
It's gone.
It's at the top for next time. Yeah.
I'll hand it off to Lorenzo in a second, but it strikes me here that, in classical physics, at least, there's a really important idea, which is this idealized notion of a rigid ruler, a straight ruler, which would allow measurement. And if there are really no straight lines, that already means that any attempt to measure so as to calculate in a quantitative way the motions of bodies in space is only ever going to be an approximation. And in relativity physics, the whole notion of a straight ruler becomes totally problematic, and there's all sorts of epistemological paradoxes that result. I think I touched on that last time. This is a critique Whitehead had of the epistemological contradictions in Einstein's theory of relativity, where, in order to know how far a body in a star was in space, we'd first need to know where all the mass intervening between our observation, our point of view, and that star. But to know where those masses were, because they, warp space, right? We'd first need to measure, but we can't measure till we know where the mass is. And so you see the problem. We first need to know everything before we can know anything. And so measurement becomes a huge problem, at least of cosmological spaces. Practically speaking, of course, we don't need a ruler to be actually perfectly straight for it to be helpful to calculate things and engineer things on the Earth. But when we get into celestial spaces, the whole idea of a straight, rigid ruler just becomes a kind of myth. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Thanks. I was thinking about the reduction of all qualities to motion, and at least at first sight, to me, Steiner is trying to do the opposite. Like, he's saying, look, we cannot really simplify any constant, any physical quantity that we derive from experience or even from our math, because when we get time squared, we should think of that as something qualitatively different as from just time. And so we should not simplify it. I think he's saying that we should not simplify constants, because we then reduce the qualities, the emerging qualities that every substance has, to just motion. Yeah, just to the ideal motion of perfectly hard little spheres, the atoms, and so we can reduce every phenomenological quality of our experience to motion. But I think that Goethe, Steiner, anthroposophy, they do the opposite. They try to preserve the qualities related to each physical constant. then one might say, okay, but we get a problem then because we have no progress in physics, because progress in physics is actually simplifying constants. I mean, you get a formula that kinds of models what we experience. That's good. But if you have another formula that can model the same phenomena that expresses the same dynamics with less variables, then the formula is more powerful. And all technological progress depends on this fact. All technological progress can be traced back to, at least in modern Galilean times, let's say, to the reduction of some constant inside mathematical formulas. And of course, Steiner is not a reactionary. He wants progress. And so I think that what he's telling us is maybe more subtle than this. It's not that we shouldn't be simplifying qualities at all, physical quantities at all, but that since the system, what we are taking into account is not the whole, because we are leaving aside the human factor. And so we are not looking at the whole thing. We're just looking at a part of the things. Then we try to simplify that. Then we actually miss some content in the simplification. And so probably going back to time and space, which are the two things that Newton took for granted, and that since they are taken for granted, if we reduce everything, that we get only motion. Well, the fact that the extreme reduct of everything, the last remainder of all is motion, it's because we start taking for granted space and time. So I guess that anthroposophy, getting science could have some progress and some form of reductionism, but it must start from a different whole, and that's the problem. But anyway, this is like another consideration. That the first part is just that, look, I think that we are trying to save physical quantities, not to reduce them to motion. I think that's the first point. Yeah, and that was it. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorenzo. It was reminding me of this distinction that Barfield makes in Saving the Appearances between dashboard knowledge and like participant knowledge, and that the dashboard knowledge is very important for technological progress, as you described, and which, you know, has all kinds of benefits for human life, like you know, advances in certain kinds of medicine, but or what have you. And maybe it's just part of the trajectory of evolution in some sense to continue to penetrate and wield those those simplified motions. But yeah, I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Karsten, when it was described that, and I'm thinking of Barfield again, his phrase interior is anterior, that the psychic is the kind of, or the spiritual or soul is movements or activities or moral activity is what gives rise to the, you know, what is being simplified. Anyway, so I just appreciate that. That was great. Hey, Angus, would you like to say anything about this image that you shared and this these statements from, or the verses from the 10th lesson? It's very fascinating.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can how much I can actually develop it. These are meditative verses. I can paste them in the messages there. And when Steiner leads us through this meditation, it's trying to these meditative verses, it's trying to sort of like root ourselves like firmly in the ground, and then sort of like move out into that. It's like I use the word counter space, so like from projective geometry. It's like this space which is beyond these realms. And Carsten was talking about Gopi's reciprocal system earlier. These verses are trying to help us evoke that state within ourselves that is beyond, it's like space and time, so like where the forces come in from, opening a space within ourselves to try and experience that. And when I was, just as I was looking at that image, I was also struck about the connection that Steiner makes about the plant world being a reflection of something, so like from it's like beyond space and time. There is this idea of this manifestation, something that is living beyond matter, in counter space, that is finding itself reflected on the surface of the earth. And he, if I remember correctly, he makes the comparison between, it's like seeing what we do when we actually see something is recreated in ourselves, although that's quite clearly so like a more from a simplistic model, it's very clearly, it's like a very physical process, but it's not actually as simple as that if you take the idea that actually we see with our etheric, we reach out with our etheric bodies through our eyes. So the point of me posting it was it's a wonderfully simple picture that you can live yourself into by reading the verses, but it's like all meditative work. It's something that grows with you.
Thanks, Angus. Rosemary, go ahead and chime in.
It's appropriate that you just brought verses, because I was going to make a connection between poetry and living into these new spaces that Kepler described in his laws. I believe that poets feel that, and that's part of their gift to the humanity, is that they convey it in language. And I discovered in reading your book, Crossing the Threshold, Matt, that Whitehead used to read Wordsworth every day. I'm a Wordsworth scholar, so I spent 3 years close relationship with Wordsworth. So I'm a living legacy of Wordsworth. And I think one of the reasons I'm as healthy and cheerful as I am is because of those years I spent with him. And so Whitehead, going to the Wordsworthian well every day to witness a human being, a fellow Englishman, who was one of the first, I think, to really describe his inner experiences in detail. And a lot of them are spatial and musical and have to do with motion too. And I was going to say, everybody, I was also impressed to learn that Whitehead wrote everything in hand. It was before, he didn't use a typewriter evidently, and he didn't leave a lot of personal material. So we can only speculate on what was going on with him. But don't compose cold on the keyboard. At least do your first draft by hand before the technological forces intervene when you're doing your creative work and your creative thinking. At least do the first part by hand before you go to the keyboard.
Yeah, I agree with that advice, Rosemary. There's something about the living curves of handwriting that I think, at least for me, and I think you agree, many others have agreed when I mentioned this, that something about the living curves of handwriting that kind of incarnates the logos in a more embodied way than keys on a keyboard, which have, really let the mechanical side of the alphabet fragment our language and our expression. And yes, Wordsworth was Whitehead's Bible. Absolutely. And it's through Wordsworth that Whitehead gets this profound natural philosophy from Germany, from Schelling and others, because Coleridge and Wordsworth went to Germany in 1898, I think, roundabouts. And that's, I think,
17.
Sorry, 17, exactly, yeah. Right. Angus, please.
Yeah, there was just one further reflection. I've been doing a little bit of a deep dive into Jung's Red Book, so individualization, and there was one sentence that really popped for me in this text. I'll just read it. Inasmuch as man individualizes himself from the cosmos, he develops the faculty of memory, which is what you were talking to, Matt, earlier. And if we compare this to something that Jung says in his Red Book, which is also very much in spirit with what we're talking about here. As day requires night and night requires day, so meaning requires absurdity and absurdity requires meaning. Day does not exist through itself, night does not exist through itself. The reality that exists through itself is day and night. So the reality is meaning and absurdity. We're getting this polarity in there, which I think is also what Steiner is trying to create in our thinking, this recognition of the other side. And related to Kepler's law that we were talking about earlier, is you've got two foci in there. It's like as part of the ellipse. The sun is one, but what is the other foci, or the focus point? Where is it coming from? And that's sort of like that's for me is part of the mystery, and I can't like take it beyond that thinking. But yeah, I just thought I would share that. It looks like Jeff was nodding. Jeff Contar, you were nodding knowingly there, as if perhaps you'd had similar thoughts about the placement of that other focal point, or perhaps I was just misreading your body language there, Jeff.
No, that's correct. On the two focal points. But also, I was just very enthusiastic about your raising up this central concept of polarity through Steiner and really through our whole project beyond Steiner.
I really am intrigued by Steiner's comments about the diurnal rhythm facilitating the sort of interiorization of our soul and spiritual lives, giving the soul some sense of freedom from its external environment, he says, I think. And there's a polar aspect to this where, in order for us to gain the autonomy that he's talking about, we need to, in a way, be willing to give ourselves up to sleep at night, and the soul and spiritual element leaves the physical and etheric behind. And in that, I guess, as a kind of compensation for when we're awake, having this autonomous sense of, being an organism more or less. We're not really independent from our environment at the physical, at any level, but in order for us to be somewhat autonomous during the day, we have to give ourselves up at night to sleep. And that there's a sort of law of compensation at work here. Because he doesn't give us, right? Yeah. What does that resonate?
So I wanted to come in there. I thought it was really interesting what you brought in there, Matt, because one of the descriptions of the astral world is like times we're not used to cause preceding effect, but effect precedes cause in the astral world. So again, we've got this polarity aspect going on. And when you talk about sleep and waking consciousness, we've got something that's the same like fundamental rhythm going on there. And the other thought that sprang to mind is that often when you talk about how the when you talk about spiritual development, it's the I impacting. It's like the very fast changing astral body, and if it brings in enough regularity to that practice, that starts impacting the etheric body. And if the etheric body is allowed to work continuously, then it transforms the physical body. So when I was actually reading the Times, I was thinking of it in terms of it's like fast moving astral, or sometimes he describes it as a second, minute and hour hand. It's like how it incarnates and excarnates. But I think like most of us here, it's like taking it much beyond to like seeing similarities. I'm still struggling with.
Yeah, Karsten.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Lorenzo shared. It's a shame he had to go, but this thing about we shouldn't give up physical quantities, and I kind of agree with him. Although I buy into the idea that eventually everything comes down to motion, but I think there's a principle of perspective at play here, and that also relates to this. I mean, this process of becoming less material in a sense and more spiritualized as a being. It's all about a shift in perspective. So one way to look at physical matter, for example, so we have this experience of a world of things surrounded by space or some kind of environment. But I think any kind of particle, or maybe I should put it another way, what we call physical mass is some kind of macroscopic variable. It's like temperature. You have a relation between, say, a lot of different molecular systems with various kinds of position and velocity and direction and so on. And a lot of these different systems are integrated into one simple number, that which we call temperature. But behind temperature, which is this macroscopic variable, there's a microscopic world, which with a lot of difference that is kind of hidden, and a lot of space that is kind of hidden in this macroscopic variable. And I think it's the same we have with physical matter and so on. Mass, the physical mass, it's a macroscopic variable. It's some kind of average, but whenever we have a particle, we can always kind of mentally zoom into it. We can travel into all these physical things using imagination and discover world upon world upon world, no matter how far we go into the microcosm or up into the macrocosm. So it's just a thought I had about Lorenzo's concern that we shouldn't give up physical quantities. I don't think we should, but we shouldn't be fooled by the physical quantities either, to think that there's nothing hidden behind. I think there is a lot to discover.
Yeah, it's a tension that we'll have to hold as we move forward. To what extent would this more Goethean qualitative approach to mathematics and science force us to give up everything about the quantitative, sort of more model-centric approach in traditional science or modern science? I think there's something to be said for the value of like dashboard knowledge and a modeling that's based on a non-participatory consciousness, but it's when it doesn't recognize itself as a kind of model, right? And again, commits this fallacy of misplaced concreteness that it becomes a problem. But we also need to be wary of the technologies which we generate as a result of this kind of modeling, because these technologies can do great violence to the living world because they're not sensitive to the living dimension of anything. Right. And so, but again, I think that's just a function of not mistaking the model for the reality. We'd gain so much by avoiding that fallacy. I see Angus has his hand up, and then we'll have to wrap it up after that.
Yeah, just another thing that I think I'll certainly be trying to keep in mind is we touched on it very briefly last week about gravity, and that's unresolved as it will remain. But when you look at other, if you look at other descriptions of the universe, so like not this infinitely expanding universe which will sort of like then one day sort of like collapse on itself, some of the other models actually do create this picture is a static universe, so that you go out somewhere and then it finishes, and that's not a model we're used to thinking about, and I think it's interesting to hold that in our minds as well. So like we are very rooted in so like how current so like accepted physics so like describes the universe, but what if that model is so like absolutely is fundamentally wrong?
Yeah,
perhaps there is like an outer casing, and then beyond that is counter space outside the circle.
Right. So yeah, we always end on such interesting, especially last time you did this too, Angus. There's so much else I go into, but maybe we can bring this back next time when we do lecture 4. But I do have to end the meeting because other professors are needing the Zoom channel for their courses this morning. But if anyone wants to lead us into lecture 4, do email and let me know. Happy to hand off the baton, or Ashton and I can keep doing the brief intros at the beginning. But we want to, give you each a chance to weigh in as well with your initial response. So let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the conversation and see you next week. Bye.